here. How did yeah? Tell me about it. It took the hackers months to figure out how to do this.
The poor and the underclass are growing. Racial justice and human rights are non-existent. They have created a repressive society, and we are their unwitting accomplices. Please understand, they are safe as long as they are not discovered. That is their primary method of survival. To keep us asleep, keep us selfish, keep us sedated.
Thanks for tuning in to another Boer Republic podcast. From a post-Trump tweet South Africa, thank you for listening. Today we have Joe joining us for a conversation about South Africa, self-determination, rebuilding our communities, practical solutions, and more. Thank you for joining us, Joe. It's a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you for having me on. Pleasure to be here.
Tell us a bit more about yourself. Which angle are you coming from, especially what's currently going on in South Africa?
Well, I'm South African originally and have lived all over the place, all over South Africa and the globe, and maybe a sort of different perspective to a lot of people. So I'm originally from the Eastern Cape, from East London. Left there as a young child to grow up mostly in the UK, but also in other areas in Europe, and moved back to South Africa at 18 as an adult. So spent a couple of years there, as a student, as working on farms even, all sorts of different, areas also in South Africa. And then recently have moved back abroad to New Zealand to study. So, very much invested in the future of South Africa, and at the same time have quite an international perspective on, what's going on there and across the world.
And it sounds pretty clear to us where you got your accent from.
Yeah, it's not very South African until I turn up in the UK and then they're convinced I'm very South African.
There's obviously another demographic in South Africa, and it's not just the Boer and it's not just, say, Afrikaners. There are many other European descendants in South Africa. You can perhaps tell us a bit more about this angle, and I think many listeners are keen to know, especially international listeners, a bit of background regarding those peoples. Yeah,
so I think in South Africa, I don't know what it's like nowadays, but definitely by the end of apartheid, we non-Afrikaans South Africans made up about 40% of the white population. So we're very numerous, and we've also got very different histories. So on my dad's side, a lot of my family date back to 1820 settlers. There's even a Boer Macy back there. So who knows how far back that actually goes. But then on my mother's side, I'm actually Greek South African. I mean, that dates back to Kimberley Gold Rush. The first came over. So, it's a long history in South Africa. We, much like the Afrikaners, we no longer really belong anywhere else. But I don't think we've got as much of awareness of ourselves as, essentially we're just not Afrikaners. But yeah, I would say actually we're Afrikaners, but not Afrikaans. We don't put out the taal, but we are definitely Africans, not Europeans anymore.
Yeah, and from that perspective, do you think there's any difference in the way that you look at South Africa now, as it is kind of an attack on Afrikaner farmers? There is the whole idea that, it is an attack against the Boer. Does it in any way feel that, not in the sense that you guys are left out, but that you are not as targeted as Afrikaners, or not?
I think we probably are a more liberal community. I think a lot of people like to fly under the radar and pretend that they weren't a part of anything throughout all of history. But the reality is that, the propaganda is anti-Afrikaner, but the actions are anti-white. And the reality is they don't actually care. Actually neither should we, because the reality is they're coming for us just as much as they're coming for Afrikaners. So I don't, people who hate Afrikaners, hate white South Africans. There's not actually a difference in their mind, except for they don't differentiate.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, you could look at it in many ways, and the same, we could all say we're all anti-communist, because that's technically what the ANC is doing. If anyone who is pro normal quality of living, whether you're black, Chinese, or white, should obviously be against what's going on. So, but that's a good perspective you give there.
Yeah, and I think a lot of like Anglo South Africans and such, don't see themselves as Afrikaans. So when all the Afrikaans rhetoric, anti-Afrikaans rhetoric is going on, they don't feel as targeted by it. So I think there's, they feel less under threat, but at the same time, when it actually gets, down to crunch time, there's no real difference in which group is targeted.
give us your perspective, and we asked this to kind of all would-be South African expats that we talk to. What is your experience of other South Africans that you meet abroad? Do they ever feel like they want to come back? Are they glad that they left? Are they very empathetic? Just give us sort of your perspective on the expats feel about South Africa and their wishes with regarding to their own movement or migration.
So I'm an expat who actually came back. So I can definitely comment on this. I think a lot of expats, even second generation born overseas expats, would be very keen to come back. You know, I spent a couple of summer holidays in South Africa growing up and absolutely love the place and feel much more connected to it than anywhere else I've been. So there's, you know, the reality is we've got major roots in Africa and we can't change that. So I think a lot of expats would come back if the situation changed, especially from countries like the UK or all the ones in, you know, the East. I think the one place you may struggle to, you know, expats may not come back from as quickly and freely as Australia and New Zealand. Living in the regions in South Africa, you know, they're very much Wenwees. All they ever talk about is South Africa. Whereas I think in Australia and New Zealand, they have a much easier time integrating. It's a much more similar culture, much more open, outdoorsy.
Yeah, that's an interesting aspect is the integration or the easy integration between what would be, or at least for the sake of ease, it seems that whites in general integrate far better into Western societies than other ethnicities. And in terms of the media presence of the news in South Africa, do you see a lot of that from mainstream news in New Zealand? Or is there basically a complete blackout of coherent information from that side?
In the mainstream in New Zealand, there's a complete blackout. The mainstream in New Zealand is really the most shocking media I've seen anywhere I've lived. I mean, it's a small country, so there's not that much, you know, market for news, but the mainstream is dominated by a few magazines all owned by the same people who own the magazines across the world. You know, it's in newspapers, it's really, really terrible coverage. I mean, a lot of it is just copy and pasted from international sites, essentially. But most people, I think, get their news from international sources. And as far as South African expats go, a lot of them just get it from Facebook and friends because much of South African news is just as bad. And there's no point, you know, subjecting yourself to it when you don't have to anymore.
I remember I was up in New Zealand a few times, and I remember once looking at one of the headlines on one of the newspapers, and it was something about some surfer that fell and cut open his face or something on his surfboard. And it was literally main headline news. And I just thought that obviously everything is going amazingly in this country, which I'm not against.
They're also good at putting a good face on, though.
Yeah, sure, I can imagine. And it was something about a big debate about whether banning, was it nude parks or something? And there was a big issue about that. So, I mean, it's that typical first world problems. That is your headlines, yeah. Then obviously you don't have a lot of issues.
Well, I mean, that's the headlines, but the reality is they're selling large portions of the country and, you know, water resources and everything to China and all sorts of legitimate problems that are going on. You know, the immigration here is a little bit out of control. All those kinds of things. But, you know, all that we hear about in the news is surfers and nude parks.
You know, speaking of headlines, how has the reaction been to President Trump's tweet regarding South Africa and farm attacks? Has there been any backlash, or has there been a bit of an uproar regarding that from your side?
I think it's being roundly ignored. You've got to remember, in New Zealand, 1 in 50 people are born in South Africa. So it's a very large South African community here. You know, white Afrikaans are the wealthiest single demographic in New Zealand. So there's a lot of, it's more what isn't said that's the issue. They just won't mention it. Or if they do, it'll just be a little footnote and it'll be, oh, Trump's a racist again, something like that. Mostly not talked about. But at the same time, amongst the population, it's actually quite well known. I've moved to a new town recently. The amount of people I meet to ask me about what's going on in South Africa and am I a farmer? Is that why I'm here? All those different kinds of questions. As far as the general populace goes about what's going on in South Africa at the moment is actually incredible. I mean, continuously blown away. I mean, the other day, someone I met, shook hands with, and they were like, "Oh, you're from South Africa? I watched a documentary about it the other day. Have you seen farmlands?" You know, where do you go with that? Like, that's, you know, they've opened the door to you telling them what's going on. So
it is great news that that's happening. You know, that's a good thing. And it just shows that alternative media gets people talking a lot more than mainstream media, which is great. And just tell us, like, you know, obviously people asking you all the time if you're a farmer and that's what you're there, is yeah, how do you usually respond? Is that a good way to pick up women in New Zealand? Is it telling them that farmer are you? What works?
As far as what talking about South Africa or the ladies?
Yeah, obviously, how is it a good way to pick up a lady saying that you are an escapee farmer from South Africa needing refuge?
I've got to be honest, I've never tried that before. I don't usually go for the puppy dog lines, but I might give that a go on your suggestion, actually.
That's great.
Yeah.
What was your reaction when you found out that Trump made it headline news? And keeping in mind, quite a while ago, he made a similar statement regarding Sweden, and there was a huge backlash from the mainstream media to say, but Sweden is fine. There's nothing going on in Sweden. And he basically forced the media to open a dialogue which they preferred keeping quiet.
Well, I think with the Sweden tweet, what he did is he proved to America and much of the world that the media will always lie about immigration to the West. And I think what he's done with the South African tweet is proven to the world that the media will always lie about white people being the victims of serious, crime and, borderline genocide. I mean, whatever you want to call it, what's going on in South Africa now. So I think as far as dropping the Red Bulls go, I think Trump is definitely king.
Yeah, he's definitely got some results going, that's for sure. The other aspect that you mentioned previously is that, when trouble sets in South Africa and when they come after you for land or whatever, they won't stop to ask you, what are your viewpoints? Are you this and that? Whether you are Anglo, whether you are Boer, whether you are even of Mediterranean descent. There's a ask questions later policy when essentially what is the zombie hordes comes down upon you. Perhaps give us a bit more of an idea about that.
Yeah, I think that even a lot of the lighter colored people are going to be in a bit of trouble for being confused for being whites. Because the reality is that, it's not, a reasoned attack that's going to happen. Target and go for it. And often they go for the easiest target. And those are the people who are, feeling confident or think that they're not in harm's way when they really are. There's no discrimination. They're very egalitarian in that sense.
Yeah, it's like the old, what they call the old pencil test. They're not going to ask you. And for those who don't know, there was a thing that if you put a pencil through your hair and it doesn't fall out, means you're not white. It was for those, as we would say, indeterminates. So yeah, you could say the same thing. The zombie hordes aren't going to wait and do a pencil test on you and then take your stuff. But again, in that case, like all crimes, as we see, all crimes are just increasing across the board. Black on black, black on Asian, black on white. Yeah, it is detrimental to all. And again, I think people have this idea that it's going to be. You wake up one day and it's like, World War Z, and you see them coming over the mountain, and it's not. And I mean, just to give people an idea who's not living here, it is a slow boil. It is the slow increase there. You just hear of more and more crimes affecting your friends, your family members, and it's a slow increase. You get to your car, and where there usually was one car guard, now there's two. Usually where there was one guy on the street, now there's two, and this guy's trying to open your boot. And it just continues from that to the point where, you get mugged a few times. I mean, I just read something now on Twitter about the ShopRite CEO basically gave a stat about they had something about 100 armed robberies of their shops this year. Now think about that. If you are an owner of a franchise and you have to deal with more than one armed robbery at your shops a day, it just shows. It's just these type of crimes just increase gradually to a point where you just can't see the difference anymore. So
yeah. I've got family who run jewelry stores in Gauteng. They actually have put ventilation in all their safes, and the safety protocol is everyone just locks themselves in the safe. Don't care about whatever is out, just, get out of the way of the armed robbers. So, yeah, it's exactly that. People overseas have no way of conceiving what it's like, as far as the crime goes. But at the same time, like you said, they're not going to come over in World War Z style. I do think in South African cities, at some stage, we probably will see program-like events where mobs go into white areas. I would not be surprised to see that in the future.
Yeah, for sure. World War Z, I have seen them get over walls that way where they just trample on top of each other and get over. joking, but I mean, in the future, I you'd sometimes think about how would it end, and I could see, in a way, you'll have different spots in the country where people have created these, sort of fortresses in a way, a bunch of sort of a circle of caravans, but obviously in a different sort of structure. So you have to do that. You have to. You basically, my house is basically a fortress. The other day, someone took my key when they went out, and I couldn't get out of my own house. It is so well protected. I can't get in and out of my own house. So you have to have it that way, because it's just, you don't know.
Yeah, my aunt who lives in Australia, but also originally from South Africa, was back in South Africa, and the holiday house that she was staying in, they locked them inside at night for safety, and there was a bushfire. And coming from Australia, where bushfires kill hundreds of people, she had an absolute freak out because she couldn't get out of the house; it had been locked. So obviously there was no problem in the end; it was no issue. But just as that kind of changed in perspective, that you can literally get to the stage where you cannot even leave your own home.
The security industry in South Africa is a booming industry for sure. And there's no doubt about
one part of the economy that always grows.
Yeah, there's no doubt about that. Specifically, the security issue and land expropriation. How has crime affected you and your family in South Africa? Just maybe on a general basis.
We have been very lucky in that not many of us have been victims of murder. So I don't have any near family members that have been murdered. But yeah, second cousin was murdered recently. Next door neighbor was murdered less than a month ago. So it's, even when very close family hasn't been victims, and, very much count ourselves amongst the lucky in that sense, still continuously surrounded by it. All of us have been hijacked and mugged and burglarized and all the, lesser crimes that, the rest of the world considers quite catastrophic. But I think in South Africa, when you are not a victim of violent crime, extremely serious, like murder or rape or something, then you count yourself as lucky. The mind boggles that that's our normal, actually.
I've seen this on interviews where South Africans have spoken, interviews overseas, and many listeners to those shows or the comment sections are full of questions like, but why do they sound so used to it? Why are they, what it amounts to is why are they so desensitized? Often, and if you've experienced this in South Africa, then you're very quick to realize, but you just go on. You have to go on. I mean, it's just the reality you live with.
Yeah. So if I think about the, just the crimes I've been party to a victim of in South Africa and compare them to here, South Africans are completely desensitized to, how much is actually going on around them. Here in New Zealand, if someone has their cell phone stolen, that's, a big issue for half a year. But in South Africa, we wouldn't even mention it on Facebook that a cell phone was stolen. So we completely cut off from what is normal life in that sense, what is normal expectations of safety and security. And I think a lot of South Africans, that slams them in the face when they leave South Africa and go elsewhere. I mean, for myself, I think the first or the second day I was in New Zealand, I drove past a house and the car pulls out the garage and drives off and leaves the garage open. There's no fence or anything. And the garage is full of wine and power tools and bicycles. And he just left it open. He's left, he's gone. And, there's all this stuff, South African buffet,
Yeah, for sure it is. I mean, we are very used to crime. And the question is always, like, can the desensitization go any further? As it is, it is beautifully done in the way that, we are the frog in the boiling water, where we've been brought to the point where we are now at you could say, an extreme crossroads, where we've been victims of crime. It's quite normal for us. I'm generally mad at my friend if he's late for a meeting because his phone got stolen, because you should be used to this and you should just adapt and just keep going. You can fix it. You can sort everything out tomorrow. The cops will not find it anyway. And where we're at a crossroads where now literally some of our friends and family are going to be thrown off their farms. And the question is, when do you put down your pens? When do you put down your laptops? When do you put down your own power tools? And you say, all right, cool, now I've got to stop. with normal living, and we've got to stand together, and we've got to fight, and we've got to make something. We've got to kind of save the country for ourselves, and that is kind of the question for me. It's like, how do you start that fire? How do you get people?
Well, I think our problem is we refuse to think of ourselves as a people anymore, or if we do, it's just in a very loose cultural sense, and we don't consider our needs and work towards those. But the reality is, if you talk to South Africans who've emigrated, 95% of them I talk to emigrate because they have been a victim of a serious crime and they had enough. They'll say, yep, I was held up at my shop the third time and I thought, no, enough's enough and I'm going. And most South Africans emigrate because they have had enough individually. And that's the problem, is we're dealing with it all individually. And actually, we're not taking responsibility for each other as a group anymore. And that's the issue that we are facing as a country, essentially. Or not a country, as a people. We just allow each other to deal with it individually. You know, when people have too much, they emigrate, and then that's the end of that. And then we're back to being frogs in boiling water again. And it's obviously not working.
Yeah, I mean, for me, there's a very deep question to that, right? And this is probably a bit deep dive into the philosophical, historical nature of the white European man. In a sense, it is our individuality which has brought us kind of to the top of, human civilization, where we thrive on individuality more than, you say, with other ethnicities.
Yeah.
We are more disagreeable. We tend to go against the grain more, and hence that's why we create more of the greatest companies in the world, why we are responsible for more scientific discoveries, because we decide to go against the group. So for me, it's as if our best qualities have in a sense been used against us. And again, again, this is me just theorizing. There's obviously very little in that, but maybe there's validity to it that they are using these aspects of our sort of ingrained genetics against us. And also the other thing is, what is the hope of really turning that around? And, I agree with that 100%. I feel very individualistic. Obviously, I do kind of feel very bonded with my culture and my people, but it is something that in about a generation or two, you're probably not going to change that. And the question is, how do you turn it around right now? Probably very difficult to do that, but there is something inherent about the white man that he does not mind being more individualistic than others.
I think I think you're 100% correct, but at the same time, there's a very big difference between old world and new world cultures. And I think Afrikaans or Afrikaners straddle that in a way that the rest of new world cultures don't. New world cultures have very, very little connection to each other within the group. They don't have much of like a feeling of brotherhood or whatever. But if you go to old world countries, the UK, Italy, first-hand experience living in both these countries, the reality is that they've got a very much an in-group sense of themselves and sense of identity and standing up for each other, which is not so much practiced anymore, but I think it's very much a part of our history in South Africa. So I think that we're definitely more individualistic as cultures and ethnicities, but at the same time, we have got the ability to do both, and we just have considered any sort of cooperation, either we label it communism or we demonize it as racism.
Well,
it also. There you go for it.
No, go for it.
No, I'm just thinking it basically shows how well the propaganda and the brainwashing has worked, you could say, in the last generation or two, because this idea of democracy and socialism has been pressed down our throats. And, as we know, the Afrikaner has survived longer than America has been a country. So surely, we should have a more stronger identity than many other white civilizations. So it is kind of a testament to long-standing propaganda that has worked.
Yeah, very much so. And I think it's especially bad in New World countries. Because the Old World is still very confident in who they are. Everyone who says, Europe has lost anything, they don't know what they're talking about. But at the same time, having, lived in both, the New World New World cultures essentially need to, stand up for themselves and stop being guilted for past, which isn't bad.
That also brings up an interesting point. Having an in-group, standing up for yourself is something that's intimately tied with having a community or having an established community. And at the same time, emigration from South Africa is something that, yes, it's unavoidable. The society we live in is such that it makes it difficult to have security. It's just security in general, never mind security of community. Now, immigration issues and the fact that in-groups amongst whites is something that's relatively frowned upon in general. How does one go about building white communities up, making our culture stronger by having communities, in-group preferences, and how does one get it across that it's okay to have your own community, to have your own people?
I think it's a very difficult thing because you're countering very extreme narratives, but at the same time, the ante has been upped so much that there's narratives crumbling without us. So I think maybe, this is something that I've been thinking about for a while. Is maybe the best way to do it is just to swap, black out for white with all the South African policies. We should have BBWEE, just do it ourselves. Let's label stuff BBWEE, and, we're all going to buy BBWEE. So, maybe we should just, use their own tactics and do it in a decentralized way. Maybe it's a bit tongue-in-cheek, but it definitely sends a message that, it's good for the goose, it's good for the gander.
I think that's actually a very strong message.
Can you just for the overseas fan base, just please just spell out the acronym?
So in South Africa, we've got race-based hiring, and covers everything. It covers contractors and businesses and laws that mean that it's called the acronym is broad-based Black economic empowerment, and it just means that you have to match the demographics of your company to the demographics of the country. So 8% of your workforce is allowed to be white, which obviously severely limits white employment opportunities, and especially in areas where we don't only make up 8% of the population. We're not evenly distributed across the country, and traditionally we're more middle class, so a lot more of us are in employment. So companies that do not meet BEE just means that they're not going to hire whites for decades. So it's especially targets young whites as far as work goes. So saying we should just do BBWEE, saying we should make it into broad-based white economic empowerment, but we would have to do that on our own.
Everyone listening right now, go onto Twitter and make this trend like crazy, because I think this is a good way of memeing this into existence. If it worked for America, it can work for us. So meme broad-based white economic empowerment, ladies and gentlemen. Let's get this ball rolling and tag this podcast into that meme. I think that's an excellent way to counter a lot of the narrative that gets thrown in our faces. Any other solutions? It seems like you have given this topic quite some thought.
Yeah, I just think that we need to, as South Africans, be continuously creating jobs. We've got this kind of programmed urge to just create jobs because there's so many jobless people. But the reality is the reason why so many, especially my demographic, young, fresh out of education white South Africans leave, is there's no work for them. They all go teach English in Korea and Hong Kong, or they, move to Europe to work on the yachts, or, wherever I go in the world, I meet young white South Africans, doing all sorts of very, very alternative jobs that they can get a visa for because there's no work for them at home. And so the only way to solve that is creating those jobs ourselves and then taking it on the chin that we no longer BBBEE. I
was just thinking about, the point you brought in before then. For me, it's a very interesting point. And if I always think, when we talk a lot about sort of the ideas of democracy and communism, socialism, anarchy, and, how do you create a system that really works? Because there's so many, obviously it's a very diverse ethnic group in this country, and we just find obviously that multiculturalism doesn't work. So how do you organize the system? And what we talk about a lot is if the principles you apply as a collective is generally the principles you should live as an individual. Otherwise, usually problems come from that, because then your individual will lose his freedom. And it's a very difficult thing to almost say, but if you say as a group, we should have something like broad-based white employment, as in Irania, where it's blanket, and it's basically we just hire and whites basically. Do we apply that to our personal lives? It sounds such a weird thing to say or do. So like, okay, I'm going to apply that to my life as well. I'm going to just surround myself, and I'm just going to employ white people, and I'm going to marry a white woman, and I'm going to make sure that I do that. I hope you get what I'm saying. It sounds
it sounds very, very weird.
It sounds very weird, and it sounds difficult to say. If you ask any random black guy, and you ask like, how many white friends do you have? I can almost promise you he's going to have a lot more black friends than white friends. Ask any white guy, it's going to be the same way. So in a weird sense, we kind of do that automatically in our lives, and I don't see that as an aspect of racism. I just see that as an aspect of culture and in-group preference.
Yeah,
but why is it so
it's reality.
Difficult for us to say that? No, it is very difficult for us to even say that. And people, obviously, the problem is that these conversations can't really be had, and that's obviously why we have this podcast. Is that if I can't go and say to all my Afrikaner friends and my tribe and say, we should all band together and create a whole community. But if you look at my life, I'm not helping any other Afrikaner people. I'm not employing any Afrikaner people.
It's a complete paradigm shift, because we've, as a people, have embraced the multiculturalism and the working together and nation building, essentially. But at the same time, we've been rejected by that, and we need to in a sense, create our own self-determination regardless of the political situation of South Africa. The only way to do that is just to make those choices as individuals, which build the collective. And that's just the reality of it. And to those of us with libertarian roots, building the collective sounds dreadfully communist. But at the same time, it's also the reality of life. We need to have a certain amount of pragmatism that we're not, free ships sailing the oceans. We live in a wild.
It is the idea of freedom of association is really important for me. And, no matter how hard I work in my life to say, for example, that I say I just want to be surrounded by white people. But funny enough, my tax money still goes to majority black people. And statistically, I am looking after 5 black children. That is, statistically, that's what my tax money is going for, probably 1 or 2 elderly as well. Now, in a sense, your money usually speaks harder than anything else. So if you look at it out of a pure sort of technical and monetary value, I can't loosen these shackles, because I'm working basically for a black government, and we all are, and they are taking our tax money and redistributing it. So in essence, there's always the question, even like Urania, they still pay taxes to the government. So in a sense, they're still feeding a larger part of the black community. But for me, it's always the only first way we can do that is we have to break the shackles to sort of the ANC government and stand together and say, all right, guys, we're going to create our own thing, and we're gonna put our taxes in there. If they come after us, we just say, sorry, you got to fix a few things before we give you back our taxes. Yeah, so there's a lot of ideas, but the government,
and I think that time will come.
Is the problem.
I think the time will come for that. But I also think in many ways we need to walk before we run, and that means building those systems as communities, as networks, and that solidarity before we put it to the test.
Maybe that's something that you can perhaps just share with us. Community building and especially having in-group preferences. You said part of your background is Mediterranean in origin, and here in South Africa, there's a stereotype that there's a Greek or Portuguese cafe or a shop on every corner in South Africa.
That's why we don't play football, because every time we get a corner, we open a cafe.
Exactly. So perhaps you can, because that's a good lesson, I think, to keep in mind when it comes to community, when it comes to in-group preference in South Africa. That's also creating opportunities. Perhaps if you can elaborate a bit more on that for our own listeners.
My Greek side of the family, we all very much have got what I'm talking about as far as community goes. The reality is I know that I've got maybe 20 people that I could phone today and get a job from, in a decent job, not just some, mop the floors. They all run their own businesses, and they all have space, and they always hire family. So, the elderly in the Greek community are all employed by, if they need to work still, they're still employed by, the businesses that are there, because it's a part of your social duty. I think the Greek word for it patridome, which means that it's talking about like the father's people. And actually that's, the first objective is to take care of each other. And at the same time, we're very much still, white South Africans. They hire a maid and a gardener out of a social duty, not because the tiny front lawn needs mowing 3 times a week. So there's still both, but they all provide each other's employment. There's never any unemployed people without a good reason.
Well, it's exactly in Irania, and they operate by that same principle. And they said they would rather have harder times but employ only white people, because in a way, a big part of why we have gone soft, if you could say that, is the fact that we have basically become dependent on cheap labor. And that is an interesting point if you look, if you look at a few generations and you see that, have we become soft in a sense? Have we become so used to, and I mean, we've mechanized, and generally the Afrikaner is obviously a very smart farmer in that sense, and his skills are known around the world. But in a sense, have we gotten soft that most things is done for us? Most of the mundane things in daily life is done for us, that we don't really have sort of an attachment to that normal hard labor. And, is that one of the downfalls of sort of the Afrikaner?
Yeah, it's definitely a sort of trap, isn't it, that you fall into? Because the problem is the moment you start employing people to do all your dirty work for you, then they've got to live somewhere, and all of a sudden your community is being displaced by the people you employ. And that's the story of South Africa, essentially. Because, there were no cities, and then we built cities and employed people to clean everything and dig for gold and whatever. And the reality is they supplanted us, essentially. Are we going to repeat the same mistake, or are we going to learn from it and, do our own work? So everyone across the rest of the world does their own work. So we're certainly not above it. And it's a small price to pay.
Yeah, no, exactly. It's that idea. But again, these lessons you learn you learn when it's too late, and it feels like it's kind of too late. It's not something that I was ever taught, in effect, saying that you've got to fight to keep your demographic homogenous. It's something that we weren't taught. Now, I'm going to give you a bit of a weird situation, but let's say I give you sort of George Soros type money, and I say, come here to South Africa, bring the white community together, pick a place in South Africa, and you've got day and night, and you've got to try save and create a small little ethno-state. I don't know, it's obviously fantastic. How would you go about that? How would you approach that? We're basically, the laws are so against self-determination. As you can see with AfriForum and Safeland, they have to go as this civil organization that really has no power, and all you can really do is scream and tweet and complain and sue, which we all know doesn't work, because here it's not the rule of law, it's not the constitution that's the outcome, it is who is in power. So it's obviously not ideal, but you are pushed to that breaking point where, I just have to step over the line. What do you think of that?
I think that it's probably going to become something that's necessary if the situation doesn't change. And frankly, I don't see the situation changing. So we eventually get left with 2 choices, which are self-determination or emigration. And frankly, having emigrated, I dislike it. So, and I wouldn't suggest that necessarily for most people living in South Africa. It's really not what most people think it'll be. Drive somewhere else, there's still normal daily life problems, and you still pay ridiculously high tax. So your standard of living doesn't necessarily go up, other than the safety aspect, and you start from zero. So it's not the best option. As far as, if I had George Soros-like money, what I would do with it, I think in South Africa, your problem many times in history has been mineral wealth. I think it's actually in many ways our undoing. It's the reason we were invaded by the British. It's the reason why we supplanted ourselves. It's the reason, for a lot of our problems. I think I would pick somewhere where it's got water wealth, or can create water wealth, and build water resources, and then go from there. Because that's all essentially South Africa needs is Afrikaner farmers, water and land. And then, you've got a good life without, the Midas problem. Everything touched turning to gold, and then can't trust anyone, and you get supplanted.
I like that. So that basically, again, goes try and bring all the whites to the Cape side and create the little border. And, not good news for the people in Orania who are surrounded by desert. Leave all the mineral wealth for the Chinese who are now getting payback for the loans they've given.
Yeah.
You've talked about something called micro self-determination. Can you give me kind of an idea of what that means?
Yeah, tell you exactly what I meant by that. I think we always think of self-determination on the Volksstaat level, where it's a separate country essentially. And actually, we need to think about it, right down to the individualistic level. And this is something that I've always wanted. I've, tried to work in sustainable agriculture for a bit. Being in South Africa didn't really fly. But, always try to build up my skills and ability to completely be in charge of every aspect of what I need on a daily basis. So that includes, and I think in South Africa, we quite developed in this, and I'll just mention what that includes. I mean, we collect our own water in our houses a lot of the time. Everyone's got JoJo's, as far as solar panels and that kind of thing, as much as you can, disconnecting from, all the services that the government provides. It's a very kind of doomsday prepper kind of way of looking at the world. But the reality is in South Africa, those things are not reliable or safe. And then when we disconnect from them, we actually are independent and able to provide for ourselves. So, and my point is that we should actually develop that further. We need to be self-determining individuals on as far as security goes, as far as even food security goes. We need to find other ways of providing food security, which doesn't necessarily rely on the food network. Because if the reality is appropriation without compensation goes ahead, farmers may not even plant the corn this year. No more millies, because that's a major investment that might get nicked before they can pay off their loans. And there's no reason why they should invest in that.
No, 100%. That's what I thought was kind of going to be your definition, and that is spot on. And we've spoken about that a lot. I'm just going to add another thing, and I've always also thought that the first issue is you have to drive the government up, and the best way to do that is obviously take away the taxes. But a full-on tax revolt is obviously not possible, and it's not the way the people are at the moment. But what you can do is you can create sort of a parallel economy with the cryptocurrencies that we have, and we've been talking about that a lot. And just want to get sort of your thoughts on that. Trying to create as much businesses through cryptocurrency, and obviously there's a lot of ways to hide cryptos from the tax thieves. And in a sense, what you see then over time is that if this happens quick, it happens to Afrikaners who are still basically maintaining the value of their money, and the rest of the economy kind of tanks. But what you find is then the ones on the parallel economy still lives a pretty decent life.
Yeah, exactly. The reality is between barter and crypto, you can take a lot of your daily life off the central economy, if you like, and go free of it. If you source your food locally rather than at the supermarket, buy from farmers, buy from hunters, that kind of thing, or do it yourself, you can pay for that via trade skills, or products that you create, or that kind of thing, or through cryptocurrency that you have. Because the reality is, even if it doesn't benefit you, it benefits the group. And the reality is, even from an anarchist perspective, is you very much rely on the group in a situation like South Africa. So even from an anarchist perspective, it's a beneficial thing to build up essentially your allies.
Where food security is concerned, this is something you've touched on. What other foolproof solutions are there to something like that, especially on an individual level?
The reality is most South Africans live in houses that have got gardens. There's a lot of townhouses like nowadays in the cities, but most people still have gardens. And the reality is they still go to Spar and buy a lot of their food. But you can grow a lot of your food. During the war period in the UK, people grew 70% of their own food in their front gardens, in the Victory Gardens. And there's no reason why you should be dependent on the kind of food delivery system, especially if that thing starts to tank. And we know, looking at other African countries that have gone the land expropriation route, is it does tank. Where you don't want to be stuck in a situation where you've got Zimbabwe shelves of emptiness and you don't have any solution for that. You should have thought of the solution beforehand. You need to be able to be self-determining. And that doesn't mean you have to be at that level straight away or at any stage up until you need it, but you need to have the skills and the knowledge and the resources to get there quickly if you do need to.
We've received commentary regarding this very aspect is everyone is so disconnected or everyone is so atomized. And how do I then start doing something that could be deemed self-sufficient or something that is self-deterministic? And these are important points to keep in mind, especially when you want to start, I wouldn't say get off the grid, but at least to start breaking away the dependency on the system that we have in place in South Africa. Because it is clear by now, if it's not clear by now, then I don't know if there's much hope left for us, but the situation is dire, and the system that we have is obviously, dare I say, anti-white, even though it is very dependent on the economy that white self-determination creates on various levels. And it's something you touched upon when it came with the economy.
Yeah, I think the reality is the situation now is very dynamic. So nobody knows which way it's going to go, but probably no good direction. So we need to be able to take care of ourselves as individuals, and we need to build the community as a collective so that we can connect and find solutions on a larger and larger scale, on a individual scale, on a family scale, on a community scale, on a not national, like ethnic scale, if you like, or cultural scale. And, the reality is results and success are quite addictive. So it's going to be a self-perpetuating system when you get a whole bunch of very productive people working together instead of working individually. And I think, it just is a case of getting the ball rolling and getting past the programming that we're not allowed to operate as a group in any way other than to socky.
Thank goodness, you're the first guy ever to use the word socky.
No, well,
that's great.
Apart from previous mentions of Yexke from Old Conscious Caracal. That's the one thing though is everyone says, but my culture is, I'm an Afrikaner, it's my culture. And there's a lot more to culture than just having a braai, watching rugby. There's a lot more to our culture that we often forget. And I bring this back to what you mentioned is that, one self-determination is self-perpetuating. And that's essentially how our culture came about. It was a very pioneering culture, at least whites in South Africa, regardless of European ethnicity. There was this aspect of self-determination that enabled us as a whole to be quite productive, to be quite successful in changing this land into something that was very much a contender on the world stage.
Yeah, dramatically so. If you compare the white population of South Africa with the population of European countries, it's tiny. And if you compare it to, European countries with a similar population, so say, the height, 5 million or whatever. If you compare that, it's like, Serbia, it's half the population of Bulgaria. These are irrelevant countries, We created a lot through our self-determination. And it's, obviously it worked before. We just need to get the ball rolling again.
I'm gonna sort of shift gears, but in the same vein, and this might be a long rant, so stick with me here. You always feel with any type of, let's call it revolution or stand, you need some kind of leader, you need some kind of front runner to kind of stand up, say this is what we're doing, who's with me, let's go. And obviously if your timing is right, then things can work out. And I want to get your thoughts on sort of a different topic that plays into that, is religion, that is such a big part of Afrikaner culture. And, I was just racking my brain out and thinking, if I look at the last 5 or 10 years, who has been able to get most Afrikaner men together? And that guy's name is Angus Buchan, who is a English potato farmer, who is obviously very religious and a preacher. But he was able to get thousands of men together on one field, and everyone listening to him for 2-3 days. Sometimes I think in a way we need some kind of very charismatic religious preacher in a way to bring everyone together, because obviously a large part of Afrikaners is still very religious. What is your thoughts on maybe even the idea that religion has contributed to this lackluster response from Afrikaners as a whole, and to maybe using it as a way to incite them to action? I hope that makes sense.
It does. I think Protestant Christianity across the world has definitely suffered from a lot of infiltration from communists, essentially. You know, being from a mixed background of Greek and English, I've got both Protestant background, and that's the church I grew up in, but also a Greek Orthodox background. And the difference is dramatic and huge. You know, the Greek Orthodox are entirely tied to who they are as far as the Greek and the Orthodox. There's no separation, and there's, you know, you can be Greek Orthodox and not be Greek, but essentially if you are, you have to swear your allegiance to Greece. You know, there's only one church and there's only one people kind of way of looking at it. And I think in a desperate attempt to you know, try deal with apartheid or whatever, I think the Afrikaner churches have, to a lesser extent than most, but definitely bought into the multicultural paradigm. And I don't think it's a solution for anyone. And I think the reality is white South Africans have moved away from that more and more in the last few years. And I think the church will follow, especially if you do get that charismatic preacher figure.
Just to interrupt you quickly there, when you say Protestant Christianity has been infiltrated by communists, do you perhaps a potential triple parentheses over the word communists? Or is it safe to assume that they are closely associated with the globalists, if I could put it that way?
I think there may be some of that, but at the same time, you know, sometimes we're our own worst enemies also.
I think that's also a very interesting point to stress, especially with regards to this conversation, is that a lot of this is our own fault. Whether you subscribe to the idea of, okay, turn the other cheek, or if you feel that one must be tolerant, or if you are of the mindset that, you know, everyone acts as individuals, there's no such thing as the group, and people should be judged on their actions, fine. But that has largely contributed to a lot of the decline we have in the West, and especially in South Africa, because there's a lot of that thinking going on here.
Yeah, but I mean, that's just one aspect. You know, people have grabbed onto one aspect of Christian message and then kind of ignored the rest. The reality is there's 2,000 years of history, of which, you know, 50 or maybe 100 include this weird mashup between communism and Christianity. And so I think it's, you know, I think exorcised is probably a good word for it, and it should be done. You know, we just need to get rid of that sort of nonsense, and it's very easy to do. You know, the reality is all the resources are there. A large percentage of Christians across the world, and I'm assuming South Africa, do not subscribe to this kind of one-dimensional view that it's all, you know, bending over backwards for all the bad people in the world. Because the reality is, yes, everything you said is true, but it's also in tension with, you know, the reality of the world that we live in. And also there's a counterpoint to all of those things. You know, everything you have to use wisdom to judge intention, not just turning the other cheek in every circumstance. That's just nonsense. That's
a good point to make. The obvious question then arises, you know, does one subscribe then to Crusades level Christianity again? You know, to have that fervor back in one's soul to take back Constantinople, that sort of thing? Or, you know, what other solutions are there then for people who wish to build up communities that way, for instance?
Just thought maybe we just need Hollywood to make one movie which sort of 300 style that puts the Christians from the Crusades in good light, and then show that movie over and over, and maybe that'll ignite the Old Testament fervor in Christians in South Africa.
I doubt that Hollywood is very pro-Christian at the moment.
Those might be your globalists.
Yeah,
for sure.
Yeah, I think the reality is people who are trying to build those sort of communities just need to educate and inform themselves on the arguments of both sides, and then just make that argument, you know, have that debate. And the reality is, if your arguments are better, which they should be, then you're going to succeed. The reality is, I mean, Christianity is basically just logocentrism, if you boil it down. So, you know, there is a kind of duty to the truth that you can, I don't want to say take advantage of, but you can definitely capitalize on and, you know, make sure that people are informed.
Yeah, I get what you say, and that's a good way of putting it. Again, you know, we've definitely feel here that we don't live in a time where it is about we're fighting with words. It's not about debate anymore. But I like the way that you describe that it is more a way of using debate to get other white Christians, or other whites for that matter, to follow the group, so that we can all bind together.
Yes.
There's definitely no more arguing to be had with the ANC, because it is they have basically used our ethics, and they have used our altruism so well against us, to the point where we are basically paralyzed and at the position that we are. Yeah, so the enemy knows us better than we know ourselves.
Yeah, and debate is for within the group, and diplomacy is for people outside of the group. So, and that making that recognition of, okay, you're someone who I can debate with, and you're someone who, I've got to use diplomacy, and war is just another form of diplomacy. So, you've got to make that judgment on someone's intentions. Are they in your group? Then after that, you can wage diplomacy against them.
That is, I just got this picture in my head as you said, war is another form of diplomacy. The next time I go to fight the zombie hordes and I reload my gun, I'm just going to shout out, "Here is my piece of diplomacy."
Well, that brings me sort of to my next question. Then is, fine if this is the case for many South Africans, many whites, especially those who are what can be described as disconnected from their roots, disconnected from culture, disconnected from faith even. What does one say to those whites who in South Africa who aren't Christian, for instance? What is their rallying banner, or what do they rally under to stand against the issues that we face, especially when one wants to build up a community? Because maybe this question answers itself in the sense that, once culture, religion, ideology, and all those things are stripped away, you still have genetic ties. So what does one gather around? What does one rally around if one isn't Christian, for instance?
I think if someone is, as you described, without culture or religion or any form of ties, I would just say to them, your choice is Cape Town or Perth. But if the reality is everybody's got something, of a, not necessarily religion, but they've definitely got culture, and they are targeted regardless because of that ethnic aspect to it, And even if that is the basis of the starting of building a community, the community in and of itself, a community is like a marriage. It takes investment into it, but at the same time, it's more valuable than just the effort you put into it. So, the moment someone's involved in a community, that's going to become important to them if it's, something that they've invested into. So I think, that's just the way to do it, is to build community, with people, and people will become caught up into it. And I think that's just the way to do it, is, just keep walking and people follow eventually.
Yeah, I like the way that you say that the debate is for in the group, and I've never really thought about it that way. You could just look at our parliament, and and that is pure chaos and comedy at its highest level. And there should be some debate within the group, but it doesn't seem that way. And no, really, I think that statement has really made me rethink about how we should sort of apply our efforts. Because you see a lot of the guys that are for our movement that are on the front line. And if you just look at Adam's roots, and bless his soul, the poor guy battles idiots every day, and the amount of redundant conversations he has to have for the fight itself. Obviously you need someone to fight that fight, and all kudos to him. But yeah, maybe the idea is more to focus within our group, to go into churches, to try and get hold of the mic and bring this message across, to try and gather up as many people as you want. Obviously we are having these conversations within our personal circles, and around the braai, halftime at the rugby, or as you go to talking with someone else. But maybe should be a more concerted effort to try and get this, to the bigger white groups at every opportunity that you can. I think that was a very good point.
And it's once again, the story is, lead by doing. Is once you have something going, once you've got a community and you use cryptocurrency amongst yourselves and you do that sort of thing, then there's something for people to join. And I think often, even when institutions are unable or unwilling to make that shift, you'll always find individuals who are very keen for it. So, it's a case of, get the ball rolling. Aranya is a classic example of it in a very extreme case, is they just had to get the ball rolling and eventually it got going. So, we can do that in a much more decentralized, less extreme form in our daily lives. All of us is to get that ball rolling.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. It's been, and that works very well. And it's like you said, if you come to, if you have this talk over a braai with a bunch of mates and everyone complains about the taxes and you say, well, I don't know why you guys are paying. I haven't paid in 2 years and that's why I drive with a Ferrari and I haven't worked for 2 years because I've got this wallet on my phone. Do you guys want it? No one is going to say no. And in essence, and the same with, I try and almost bring Aranya up in every conversation as a way to just to kind of obviously measure where people are at. And the reactions are obviously quite different. But what I find is a lot of people, they tend to mock it and they say they're way too conservative and crazy. But then they will throw in a comment because you'll make an odd comment. It's like, I bought some property there so I could store my bars of gold. So when the war comes, I can go there and hide and reload. Mm-hmm. And then some people will say at some point in the conversation, when all of this happens, we'll just phone you and we'll make sure to come live at your place at Aranya. And so there is always, I think it's about just getting these ideas into people's heads. The more you talk about it, and then just get like you said, get the ball rolling.
Exactly. It's about building that safety net, that security, that community, and then just expanding that. That's all Aranya is. It's just locationally different. We can do that in anywhere that we live. We just need to be intentional and gather around us people who are willing to run with that.
Yeah, and they are just living their principles, which we are talking about now. And it's kind of the same as if anything we can tell our listeners and, try and every conversation that you can, doesn't matter if you make it uncomfortable, but bring up these issues. Test where people are. Maybe there's one person you can turn so you can get someone who's going to work with you. Obviously, don't do it on your first date. Wait at least to when the bill comes. But try. It is definitely time to get things uncomfortable.
For sure, I agree.
That's the overarching sentiment to take with today. I think is to reiterate that there should be no more brother wars. Despite your ideology or your sentiments, any differences that you might have, it's a question of sucking it up and, realizing that we should be standing together, especially now more than ever. As we close this off, is there any additional advice you'd like to give to fellow South Africans, and perhaps even those listeners in the West who feel that they can use some of this advice?
Yeah, all I would say is, Stefan Molyneux even said it the other day when he was like, find your tribe, find your community and build it. It's exactly that. That's where we're at in the world, and that's what we need to be doing. In South Africa, our issues face us, staring in the face, but across the rest of the world, you're a couple of years behind, or it's more opaque what you're up against. But that's what you need to do. Yeah. This was a really interesting conversation full of practical ideas, even some really, really good intellectual ones. Thank you for joining us, and we'd love to have you on again. Just to add this, is there any way that you'd like people to get in contact with you? Do you have any plans for the future? Do you have any social media links that you might like to share? Yeah, I've just got my Twitter, which is also under Joe. I'm sure they'll put the link in the description for me. No, definitely. But other than that, studying at the moment abroad, so I'll probably see how I go once that's done. But yeah. Great. Well, thank you for joining us for this conversation. It was excellent. I think we should do this again, especially seeing as how many of the events in South Africa are winding up, I should say. Definitely makes for interesting conversation. Thank you again for joining us, Joe. We really appreciate it. It's been a pleasure. Thank you for taking the time to listen to another Boer Republic podcast. Please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. And if this message resonates with you, please spread it as far as you can. Your support is appreciated. We also welcome cryptocurrency donations, and any support we receive in that regard goes to improving our content.
as well as enabling us to do more documentary and investigation style videos. The addresses can be found in the description below. Any feedback is encouraged, and we look forward to engaging with you on our various social media platforms. You can find us on a variety of social platforms, and you can find those links below. Included is our email address, which you can use to contact us. We update as regularly as we can, so please follow and reach out to us. Until next time, stay safe, wherever you may find yourself.